Somewhere in a cave in the Middle East, more than 60,000 years ago, someone left behind the scraped remains of a meal. No bones. No signs of meat at all in that particular layer. Just a faint, almost invisible residue of plants, ground down, processed, and eaten. For decades, that kind of evidence was almost completely overlooked. Archaeologists dug for spear points, for arrowheads, for the bones of hunted animals, because those were the things that survived clearly enough to study, and the things that fit a familiar story. Early humans as hunters, chasing down meat across an ancient landscape. But hidden in plain sight, stuck in the calculus of ancient teeth, buried in layers of cave sediment, and preserved in microscopic traces on stone tools, was a completely different story. A story about plants, about which leaves would keep you alive and which ones would kill you, about digging in dirt for hours to find a single starchy root, about a kind of knowledge so essential to survival that forgetting it was never really an option. So, what did the first humans actually eat before there was any such thing as a carrot, a potato, or a head of lettuce? Before farming existed at all? The answer turns out to be stranger, more resourceful, and far more sophisticated than most people ever imagine. To understand what early humans ate, you first have to let go of the modern idea of a vegetable entirely. There was no produce aisle. There was no cultivated crop bred over generations to be large, sweet, and predictable. Every single plant food available to early humans was wild, meaning it had not been shaped by human hands at all. It grew wherever the local environment allowed it to grow, in whatever size, toughness, and bitterness nature happened to produce, and finding it, safely, reliably, and often enough to matter, was one of the central survival challenges of early human life. Researchers studying the diets of early hominins have drawn on several very different lines of evidence, and each one tells part of the story. Chemical analysis of ancient tooth enamel, using a technique that measures the ratio of different carbon isotopes absorbed from food during an individual's lifetime, has allowed scientists to reconstruct what broad categories of plant species like early Australopithecus were eating millions of years ago, long before anything resembling a modern human existed. This isotopic evidence indicates that some early hominins consumed substantial amounts of foods derived from what are called C4 plants, a category that includes many grasses and sedges, alongside the fruits, leaves, and underground plant parts more commonly associated with primate diets. This was a genuinely significant discovery because it suggested that early human ancestors were already exploring a broader range of plant food sources, including tougher, more fibrous plants far earlier than researchers had previously assumed. Dental evidence adds another layer to this picture. Microscopic wear patterns on fossilized teeth, studied under high magnification, can reveal whether an individual was regularly chewing tough, gritty, fibrous plant material or softer fruits and leaves. Researchers examining these wear patterns across different early hominin species have found considerable variation, suggesting that diet was not uniform across the human lineage, but instead shifted and diversified as different hominin populations adapted to different environments, some leaning more heavily on tough underground plant parts, others on softer fruits, depending on what their local landscape actually offered. This brings us to one of the most important and most debated ideas in the entire study of early human diet: the possibility that underground storage organs, the swollen roots, corms, bulbs, and tubers that many plants use to store energy underground, played an outsized role in early human survival. Researchers studying the nutritional properties of wild tubers found across the African savanna have noted that many of these underground plant parts are available year-round, even during dry seasons when fruits and leaves become scarce, because the plant stores energy underground specifically to survive drought and fire. For an early human population trying to survive unpredictable seasonal shortages, a reliable, calorie-dense food source that could be dug up regardless of the season would have been enormously valuable. This idea, sometimes referred to informally among researchers as the underground storage organ hypothesis, remains genuinely debated rather than fully settled. precisely because underground plant material rarely preserves well in the archaeological record. Roots and tubers decompose quickly compared to bones or stone tools, leaving very little direct physical evidence behind. What supports the hypothesis is indirect but suggestive, including comparative studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups living in similar environments, and anatomical studies suggesting that certain features of early human hands and dentition would have made digging and processing tough underground plants comparatively efficient. Researchers are careful to describe this as a well-supported and influential hypothesis rather than a fully proven fact, precisely because the physical evidence that would settle the question definitively is so difficult to recover. Ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies offer a genuinely valuable, though indirect, window into what this kind of foraging might have actually looked like in practice. Extensive research conducted among San communities in the Kalahari Desert throughout the 20th century documented an extraordinarily detailed body of plant knowledge passed down across generations, knowledge sophisticated enough that researchers studying it were often startled by its precision. Traditional foragers in these communities could reportedly identify dozens of different edible plant species, from subtle, easily overlooked surface signs, a particular leaf shape, a specific pattern of vine growth, even when the plant itself was barely visible above the ground. Digging a short distance down at exactly the right spot could reveal a tuber or root large enough to provide meaningful calories and hydration for an entire day. This kind of landscape-specific expertise, precise enough to locate food that would be completely invisible to an untrained eye, almost certainly reflects knowledge refined and transmitted across an enormous span of human history, even though it cannot be directly dated back to the deep archaeological past with certainty. Beyond underground storage organs, the plant portion of the early human diet likely included a remarkably wide range of other foods, and here, the direct physical evidence becomes considerably stronger. Archaeobotanists, researchers who specialize in identifying and analyzing ancient plant remains, have recovered charred seeds, preserved plant fragments, and microscopic starch grains from numerous archaeological sites, painting a far more detailed picture than toothware or isotopes alone can provide. One of the most remarkable of these sites is Ohallo II, located on the shore of the Sea of Galilee in what is now Israel, dated to roughly 23,000 years ago. The site was submerged under lake water for thousands of years after it was abandoned, which created unusually low oxygen conditions that preserved organic material far better than most archaeological sites ever manage. Excavations there recovered an extraordinary collection of more than 140 different identified plant species, including wild wheat and barley grains, along with clear physical evidence of grinding stones used to process them. This is direct, confirmed archaeological evidence, not inference, and it demonstrates that humans living tens of thousands of years before the invention of farming were already collecting, processing, and almost certainly consuming wild cereal grains as a significant part of their diet, using tools specifically adapted for that purpose. Grinding stones themselves, found at numerous sites across different continents and dating back tens of thousands of years in some cases, offer some of the clearest physical evidence available for how early humans actually processed plant foods before eating them. Researchers analyzing the microscopic wear patterns and residue left behind on these stones have been able to identify traces of starch consistent with grinding seeds, roots, and other plant material into a more digestible, less fibrous form. This detail matters enormously, because raw plant material, particularly tough roots, seeds, and grains, is often extremely difficult for the human digestive system to break down efficiently on its own. Grinding, pounding, and eventually cooking dramatically increased how many usable calories a person could actually extract from a given amount of plant food, effectively multiplying the nutritional value of the same raw ingredients. This connects directly to one of the most significant developments in the entire history of human diet, the control of fire, and specifically its use for cooking. Researchers studying the archaeological evidence for controlled fire use, including well-documented evidence from sites such as Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, have found evidence for fire control stretching back at least 1 million years, though the exact date fire first became a consistent part of daily life across different human populations remains an active area of research and, in some cases, genuine debate. What is far less debated is the effect cooking would have had once it became a regular practice. Heat breaks down tough plant cell walls and complex carbohydrates that the human digestive system otherwise struggles to access efficiently, meaning a cooked root or tuber can deliver substantially more usable energy than the same food eaten raw. Some researchers have proposed that this dramatic increase in caloric efficiency may have played a meaningful role in supporting the evolution of larger human brains, since brain tissue is extremely energy expensive to maintain. This remains a compelling and influential hypothesis actively discussed among researchers studying human evolutionary biology, rather than a fully settled conclusion. Since isolating the specific effect of cooking from other contributing factors in brain evolution is genuinely difficult to do with certainty from the available evidence. Leafy greens and shoots present a different and in some ways more difficult set of challenges than roots or grains, because many wild leafy plants contain natural chemical compounds that evolved specifically to deter animals, including humans, from eating them. Bitterness in a wild plant is very often a direct chemical warning sign, and learning to distinguish a genuinely dangerous bitter plant from a merely unpleasant but harmless one would have required exactly the kind of detailed, accumulated, community-transmitted knowledge that anthropologists have documented so extensively among modern foraging societies. Ethnobotanical research, the study of how different human cultures traditionally use and understand plants, has repeatedly found that traditional foraging communities maintain extraordinarily specific knowledge about which wild greens require special preparation before they are safe to eat, some requiring extended boiling, others requiring the plant to be soaked in water for a period of time to leach out harmful compounds before consumption. This kind of detoxification knowledge, refined through trial, observation, and communal teaching across generations, represents an enormous and easily underestimated body of accumulated human expertise. One that almost certainly stretches back deep into prehistory, even though it leaves essentially no trace in the physical archaeological record. The consequences of getting this wrong were not abstract. Many wild plants contain compounds that are genuinely toxic if eaten raw, in excess, or without proper preparation, and researchers studying the chemistry of wild plant toxins have identified numerous compounds capable of causing serious illness or death. This means the accumulated plant knowledge held by early human groups functioned as something close to a matter of life and death, passed down not through any written record, since none existed, but through direct demonstration, careful instruction, and almost certainly, in at least some cases, through hard and sometimes fatal trial and error absorbed collectively as a community lesson rather than repeated by each individual separately. Anthropologists studying oral knowledge transmission in traditional societies have consistently found that this kind of practical, high-stakes ecological knowledge tends to be taught with unusual precision and repetition compared to less critical information, a pattern consistent with the enormous cost of getting it wrong. Seasonal availability shaped this entire relationship between early humans and their plant food sources in ways that are increasingly well understood through the combined evidence of archaeobotany and paleoclimate research. Different plant foods become available, edible, or nutritionally worthwhile at very different points across the year. Fruits ripen for a limited window before spoiling or being consumed entirely by animals and insects. Certain leafy greens are only tender and palatable during specific growth stages before becoming tough or bitter. Seeds and grains typically become available during a concentrated harvest period following their growing season. Underground tubers and roots, by contrast, often remain accessible across a much wider stretch of the year, which is part of why researchers studying the underground storage organ hypothesis consider them such a potentially important fallback resource during lean seasons. This seasonal variability strongly suggests that early human groups needed to track an enormous amount of location-specific botanical knowledge simultaneously. Not just which plants were edible in the abstract, but precisely when and where each one would actually be worth the effort of finding. Researchers studying the foraging patterns of modern hunter-gatherer societies have documented remarkably detailed seasonal rounds, essentially mental calendars mapping which locations would offer which specific foods at which times of year, often refined and adjusted continuously based on accumulated experience of local rainfall, temperature, and plant growth patterns. While these specific systems cannot be directly observed in the deep archaeological past, the underlying ecological pressure that would have produced something similar, plant foods appearing and disappearing on a predictable but demanding seasonal schedule, would have applied with full force to early human populations navigating similar environments many thousands of years earlier. The picture becomes even more detailed once researchers turn to more recent prehistoric populations, including Neanderthals, whose plant-based diet has become considerably better understood in recent years through advances in analyzing dental calculus, the hardened plaque that accumulates on teeth during life and can trap microscopic food particles for tens of thousands of years afterward. Researchers analyzing dental calculus recovered from Neanderthal remains at sites including Shanidar Cave in Iraq and Spy Cave in Belgium have identified microscopic starch granules showing clear signs of heat damage consistent with cooking, alongside plant material identified as likely including legumes and other starchy plant foods. This represents direct physical evidence, rather than inference alone, that Neanderthals were processing and cooking plant foods as a meaningful part of their diet, complicating the older and more simplistic assumption that Neanderthal diets consisted overwhelmingly of meat. Taken together, this accumulated evidence points toward a much more balanced and sophisticated picture of ancient human diets than the popular image of primitive hunters chasing meat across open plains. Researchers studying the full weight of the archaeological, isotopic, and dental evidence increasingly describe early human diets as highly varied and deeply dependent on detailed local plant knowledge, with the specific balance between plant foods and animal foods varying considerably depending on location, season, climate, and the specific resources available in any given environment. Populations living near coastlines or rivers may have relied more heavily on aquatic resources. Populations in more arid, plant-scarce environments may have depended more heavily on hunting. But across nearly every environment studied, plant foods appear to have represented a substantial, consistent, and often underappreciated portion of the overall diet. The eventual shift toward deliberate agriculture, beginning independently in multiple regions of the world roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, did not appear out of nowhere. It emerged from populations that already possessed an extraordinarily deep, accumulated understanding of which wild plants were worth cultivating, which ones produced the most reliable yield, and which growing conditions favored which species, knowledge built up over an almost unimaginably long period of wild foraging that came before it. Sites like Ohala II, with its wild cereal grains and grinding stones dated thousands of years before agriculture began, offer a genuine glimpse of exactly this kind of foundational knowledge already firmly in place, long before anyone had ever deliberately planted a seed with the intention of harvesting it later. It is worth being precise about where this entire picture rests on solid, direct evidence, and where it leans more heavily on careful, well-supported inference. Isotopic analysis of ancient teeth, microscopic dental wear patterns, preserved plant remains from waterlogged sites like Ohala II. Residue analysis on grinding stones, and starch granules trapped in ancient dental calculus all represent direct physical evidence, recovered and analyzed using established, repeatable scientific methods. The underground storage organ hypothesis, while genuinely influential and supported by considerable indirect evidence, remains a hypothesis rather than a fully proven certainty, precisely because the plant material at its center degrades too quickly to leave the kind of direct physical trace that would settle the question beyond doubt. Researchers studying this period are consistently careful to draw this distinction, treating confirmed physical evidence and reasonable, well-supported inference as related but genuinely different categories of knowledge, rather than blurring the two together. What emerges from all of this research is a story fundamentally different from the popular image of early humans as simple, meat-obsessed hunters stumbling through a hostile landscape. The reality appears to have involved an extraordinarily detailed, closely observed, carefully transmitted relationship with the plant world, one built not on luck, but on an accumulated body of ecological expertise passed down across countless generations, refined constantly through observation, necessity, and the very real cost of getting it wrong. Every leaf correctly identified as safe. Every bitter root properly prepared to remove its toxins. Every hidden tuber successfully located beneath dry, unpromising ground during a lean season. Each of these represented a small victory in an ongoing, high-stakes relationship between early humans and the plants growing all around them. A relationship built entirely through trial, careful observation, and knowledge passed down long before anyone ever wrote a single word of it down. The next time you walk past a vegetable stand, or a garden growing tomatoes and lettuce in neat, predictable rows, it is worth remembering that every single one of those plants exists today because countless earlier generations first learned, the hard way, out in the wild, exactly which plants were worth the risk of eating at all.